Welcome to Vision in Action Live. We have a second of two presentations on fulfillment plans today and a discussion with a guest, Dr. Jim Treleaven, CEO of Via Strategy Group, clinical associate professor also at University of Illinois in Chicago, and the author of X Formation, Transforming Business Through Interim Executive Leadership. Welcome, Dr. Treleaven. I'm Jim Boswell. I'm your host and the author of Lifelong Fulfillment, Take Charge of Your Life. So today's presentation will be on fulfillment plan evolution, what happens after you initially start it. And it lays out how to carry on the lifelong fulfillment process by answering questions about who you are, what you want out of life, and what it takes to accomplish those goals. Moreover, it lays the groundwork for all your subsequent plans as a mature adult and retiree. So to remind you, this discussion is follow-on to Young Adult Fulfillment Plans, which was presented 2 weeks previous to this. So as you can see, we've left that in gray, and we're focusing on what mature adults and retirees would continue to do to evolve their fulfillment plans. In general, they're doing the same self-discovery, self-determination, and resilience training that they did as young adults. And they're also focused on continuous improvement in the areas of knowledge, experience, and experimentation. And they're doing iterations now of fulfillment plans. The one they had at age 20 is probably no longer appropriate if they're in their 40s. And so obviously the goals have to change and the tactics do as well. But we hope that with doing that this is being done authentically, in tune with one's nature as they understand it today. They do it across their personal lives, in their career, in their family, relatives, friends, etc. And they do it despite upsets and changes in strategic redirection, things like death, marriage, moves, and things like that. So part of what they're doing is working on mastering the process. The first time you do it, you're not a master of the process. You're very much on the learning curve and very low on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what you're doing now as a more mature participant is to read, learn, and augment your critical thinking skills. This includes engaging recognized authorities through books, through research, and across critical disciplines. And yes, even those that we don't prefer to be expert in, like math or science or economics. It includes working with authoritative point solutions that we individually now vet, to practice factual research, to evaluate the alternatives presented by doing that research, and to deciding what solutions fit our purposes. And we're continuing to get better and better at focusing on facts and staying focused, learning how, what, and who to trust, who is unbiased, and what's valid for our purposes, and to optimize our Johari window visibility so that we get more than our own viewpoint involved in our decision process. And we stay on focus. We use things like Pareto and the diminishing points of returns to keep us always focused on priority goals, the 20% that returns 80% benefit. And we focus using strategic goals and tactical action plans. So let's look a little further. In lifestyle development, what we are trying to do is get you to a point where you're honoring who you are and what you want throughout the process. And so to break it down into the pieces that lifelong fulfillment identifies, you're working with knowns, things you like and dislike, things you want and things that are total demotivators. You understand your strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats position at any point in time. Again, you're using maximum Johari window optimum visibility so that you know more about your environment and what can be effective in that environment. And you're also focused on your uncensored interests, activities, and relationships, things that you've come to realize without a lot of qualifiers represents things that are important to you. And you've also come to recognize your resources, constraints, and the means necessary to act on your plan. And then you're off working your priority plan objectives. You're doing things like experimenting, testing, researching, learning. You're probably into continuous learning at this point, and you're responding to change, upset, failures, and successes as they occur. And you're integrating those results back into revised sets of objectives moving forward, and or refreshing those objectives on a periodic basis or on demand. And that's the way the work goes. So to help in that, point solutions integrate into lifelong fulfillment processes, and they address specific point concerns that are often siloed and not interdisciplinary in the real world. Here's a partial list of maybe about 10 references out of the total of hundreds that are on the website that you should be considering. One is Abundance by Peter Diamandis. Paradox of Choice, Why More is Actually Less by Barry Schwartz. Something About the Hydrogen Economy by Jerry Rifkin. Tailspin, Looking at What's Going On in the United States by Stephen Brill. Moving from Striving to Thriving, which is a very important part of positive psychology, and this courtesy of Bruce Smith. We point you toward 40 development assets. We also point you to How to Forgive for Good, thanks to Fred Luskin. And What is Grit About, as articulated by Angela Duckworth. And How does Science Intersect with Life? A lot of us are in a quandary. This will help get you some feeling for how that works. So we're short today, but just summing up on those things, keep striving the way you're going. You're actually living and developing your best life at this point. The responsibility and objectives and execution really all relies upon you. Yes, other people are involved. You can always ask for opinions and so forth, but at the end of the day, it's your choice. That's the only way it remains authentic to your own personality. You're doing a good job now, hopefully having learned how to Paretoize, to look at the 80-20 rule and decide what has the biggest return on investment and how quickly that investment can be returned. And you're focusing on facts as opposed to emotions and opinions that are unsubstantiated. And you've learned that when you don't have the knowledge and tools you want, it's time to dig in and figure that out. So the Fulfillment Plan Evolution newsletter is on the website for you. It summarizes all of this in much more detail. And a lot of other tool sets and collateral materials are at lifelongfulfillment.com. Please avail yourself of those at your leisure. And moving right along, now's the time in our program when we entertain perspectives of those leading self-directed lives and certain point solution experts. Please join me today in welcoming Dr. Jim Treleaven. He's CEO of VIA Strategy Group and Clinical Associate Professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and author, actually, of X Formation, Transforming Business Through Interim Executive Leadership. Welcome, Dr. Treleaven, to Vision in Action Live.
Glad to be here, Jim.
Well, great. We're happy to have you. Maybe there's some additional background data about beyond your titles that you might want to share with this audience.
Oh, it goes way back, Jim. So the short story is I started my career as an engineer, designing computers that are now all in museums.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. And are substantially larger than what anyone thinks of as a computer today. But so anyway, and then so undergraduate in engineering, then graduate school in engineering, and then I got my MBA and started the most difficult period of my career, which was I switched from being an engineer to going through IBM's sales training program.
Oh boy.
That was a shocker. However, I would recommend, I asked my students over all these years, and it's probably several thousand by now, how many of them expect to go into sales? I'm up to 8.
Okay.
And I point out to them that so I ask them how many are going into consulting or investment banking or whatever it is. And I tell them all they will all be in sales at some point in their career. So get ready for it. And, and the reason I ask that is that I found that training to be, and then spending some time in sales as one of the most valuable parts of my career. It was as much of my career, a lot of it was sort of by accident. And that's true for a lot of people. And when I talk about the C-suite, that's true for them as well. And then I also quite by accident, and I rose to be VP of Sales and Marketing in a large subsidiary of what is now JP Morgan Chase. But then I went in to be the CEO of a very small 40 years ago artificial intelligence company. And it was had no revenue, no cash, no product to sell, and no prospects of any of the above. So you can ask why I did that, but in any case, a whole bunch of smart guys out of MIT who could build pretty much anything, but they were building things that were of interest to them, not things that were of interest in the marketplace. And so we got them to do that, and the company ended up being successful. It was acquired. And so that was my introduction, quite by accident, to a career in turnarounds, which is what I spent the next many years doing. I learned a lot about what the C-suite is like. And, they were generally smaller to medium-sized companies. The largest was $500 million, though. Some public, some private. Public companies are an interesting beast. But my view of leadership is probably a little bit different. And I sort of learned that actually in that first company that I mentioned. Some of the, we had to raise capital, obviously, but some of the potential investors who were, and I am one, but who were MBAs from the usual schools, they expected the CEO to walk into the office, pound on the desk, and fire half the people. And in some of my jobs, we had to let a lot of people go, but that's not my view. I mean, and actually, I think it's the wrong view in any case. But so I think that the key for anyone in the C-suite, whether it's the CEO or the CFO, is to be able to get the most out of their people. They're the ones who are going to have to do it. They're the ones who know the most. And in most of the companies I went into, we had to make some pretty drastic changes early on. One of the companies was public. We had to, and they're virtually all software companies. Most of the expenses in a software company are people, and this company had only 2 months to survive. So we had to reduce the size of the employee base by 40%. And that was pretty difficult. But and you mentioned change management in your book, so that was a key aspect. After we had to do it right away, and so I don't even know anybody in the company. I don't even know where the men's room is, and so we have to do that right away. So how are we going to do it? So we put together what John Cotter would call the guiding coalition. And it was people from throughout the company, including, senior people, obviously, but also first line people, an engineer, a help desk person, a salesperson, and gave them the task of figuring out how to come up with an organization structure that would function better with 40% fewer people.
Right.
And lo and behold, they did. So they were empowered, and they came up with a great solution We had some very large customers who were very unhappy: General Motors, Chrysler, Boeing, Home Depot, and it was a supply chain software company. And um, so it was a pretty critical application in these companies, and they were all, some suing us already, and almost all of them looking to throw us out. So we had a pretty big challenge, but I would say the people really stepped up. The advantage of that approach was everybody in the company knew they had a voice in the room. If I'm a salesman, the guy that I sit next to, or girl that I sit next to, was in the room. And so I knew I had a voice. And finally, when the decisions were announced, those people became the evangelists for that change. So it did, obviously it was traumatic, but it was very successful. And so I think the role of the C-suite, and this would be true for CFOs and others as well, the role of the C-suite is to get the most out of the people. And it's not somebody that's making all the decisions or any of those kinds of things. And that's my thought. And in the book that you mentioned, a lot of it is about interim C-suite people, which means it's a sort of short time frame. You go in and you're filling in, and in most of the cases, or many of the cases cited in the book, they were turnarounds, and so you have no time, very little time to act, and it's a real challenge. So, but while doing all of that, I stayed in graduate school forever, because my plan, after working for a million years, was to teach, which is what I do now in the business school, as you mentioned, at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And I find that a very fascinating career change for sure.
Yeah, in my time in Chicago, business was a booming concern for a lot of people, myself included, and University of Illinois came up all the time. Yeah.
Yep. And it's the largest school in Chicago.
Right. Right. So the people in the C-suite, it sounds like, in startup situations, you're going to gravitate toward people who've maybe seen turnarounds before. That particular skill set of mobilizing employees, I understand how important what you're saying is, because it's really hard to, from the top, direct it down. That sort of becomes scorched earth sometimes. But do most of the CXO suite come to startups with that kind of experience under their belt?
It varies. There's no sort of normal answer to that. And before I answer that, not every situation is a turnaround. So,
right.
Companies with, like you mentioned, startups that may have great technology, the skill set there is a little bit different than it would be in turnarounds. I mean, a lot of the things are the same: empowering the employees and those kinds of things, because they're the smart people that can do it.
Right.
And I've had the opportunity to meet some pretty well-known CEOs of startups, like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and people you recognize. And they all come with different skills, somewhat different skill sets. Bill Gates is always presented as sort of the techie, and he really was the manager. He was the CEO. He was not.
Right.
He was not writing code. And Steve Jobs was also not the techie, but he was the visionary in Apple, and he was the one who was able to come up with sort of innovation around design and what he thought needed to be developed. and then other people developed it. So, it's there's no one answer. There's no one size fits all. And, whoever needs to be CEO of General Electric is that's a different job too. So
Different job altogether. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Um, Most CXOs are highly educated people, are they not?
on average, yes. um, but not universally for sure. I mean, obviously Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard.
Sure.
um, so so he was, clearly a smart guy, but but most of his education was on the job. And so, but on average for sure. And some people would argue that the more education is a disqualifier, but that's um, I personally wouldn't, but in any case.
Mhm.
So, it's I say that they, most of them are most, but universally the sort of common denominator is they're all pretty bright and they're all able to motivate people. And, and using Steve Jobs as the example, visionaries, the key even to the turnaround that I mentioned on the supply chain company was we had to have a vision of where we were going. And that had to be communicated. Steve
Right.
Jobs was clearly sort of famous for that. But
Yeah.
so it's there's no one answer.
Right. Okay. Um, are there any underlying characteristics of a leader at the CX in the CX suite that you would say are really important? I mean, yeah, the smart helps, diligent, experience, but more along the personal arena. Like the fortitude, the sense of persistence, to stick with it. Good and tough times. Are there things like that that are basic foundations that most CXOs need to have?
I think you touched on several of them. One is um, having the vision for the company and being able to communicate that effectively. I think persistence is really important, particularly in startups, because it never goes the way you plan, and sticking with it is really important. And then I'll add one thing in terms of sort of personal characteristics would be people with high emotional intelligence.
Ah,
We talked about high IQ intelligence, but high EQ intelligence for the C-suite is really important. And we could talk about that forever, what that means, but to sort of make the short version, people who are very empathetic, people who listen, active listening is a key skill for the C-suite.
mhm.
And so all of the skills that make up high emotional intelligence, I think, is very important for people that are successful in the C-suite.
Right, right. Yeah, that all makes pretty good sense. Okay.
Let me add
Well,
one thing too,
sure,
and
go ahead, please.
that is the you need to understand what the business of the company is. Um, there are some big issues in terms of um, everything from board members to C-level people who rely on the people who are telling them what's going on. You don't need to be able to, in a software company, write the code, but to put it bluntly, you need to know when they're BSing you.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important, and let's take Enron as an example. Enron got in trouble because they were doing a lot of um, financial engineering that was unethical. And the problem was the board didn't have the skill set to recognize that. So I think the most important part of the legislation, better known as SOX or Sarbanes-Oxley, is that every public company board has to have an audit committee, and the chair of the audit committee has a certain set of qualifications that are spelled out in the legislation. You need to have been a CFO, you need to have a CPA, or you need to have been a CEO of a public company, meaning you have to have enough experience in the space to know when somebody's BSing you. And, that's how Enron got in trouble. And so, but that's also true, for tech companies too. You have to have some board members who are savvy enough in the tech space. You don't need to be able to write the code or develop the electronics or whatever it might be, but you have to, have enough experience and knowledge in the space to not to be able to do it, but to be able to make sure it's heading in the right direction, if that makes sense.
No, it does indeed. It does. Well, as we wrap this up, are there any closing comments you'd like to make to our audience, or any comments about lifelong fulfillment, if you so choose?
Yes, the last thing I'll say, and you sort of touched on it in the introduction, is, kind of how do you get there? And, you need to be flexible, take risks, try things, and go where that takes you. I don't know that a lot of people that end up in the C-suite started their career at 22, coming out of college or whatever it might be, saying, I want to be the CEO of IBM.
Right.
Some of them do, but that's with no basis in reality. But, take interesting opportunities, try things, take risks, and that will help you be very successful and take you at the end where you would like to be.
All right. All right. Well, is there any need to review how people might reach you if they need to, or anything about your book that you would like to close with?
The book is on Amazon, so that's easy.
Great.
And you can look me up on LinkedIn, or my email address is jbt3@uic.edu. It's the shortest email I have. The company email is very long, as you can see in the subhead.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Vision in Action Live.
I appreciate it, Jim. And by the way, I enjoyed your book quite a lot.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, with that, we'll just adjourn. Have a great day.
You too.
I want to thank our guest today, Dr. Treleaven, for his insightful comments about the CXO suite. Very, very revealing. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on Vision in Action Live today. Podcasts are every 2 weeks, and they're announced in advance. Please check out the Fulfillment Plans Evolution newsletter on the website. The book is also available at lifelongfulfillment.com, as is collateral materials and this particular podcast as well. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next episode.